Tonight, we re-stepping onto some of the quietest paths in all of European history. The old roads that seemed to promise a destination, yet ended in fields, forests, or gentle stretches of land where nothing particular waited. These were the roads people once walked not because they led to something important, but because they existed, leading softly through landscapes shaped by time rather than purpose. They were peaceful, slow, and strangely comforting, the kinds of roads where a traveler might stop, look around, and feel as though the world itself had paused for a moment. Many of these paths have disappeared now. Some are buried beneath modern towns. Others rest beneath fields, long forgotten. But for centuries, they guided shepherds, wanderers, small caravans, and curious travelers, not toward grand destinations, but through quiet experiences. These roads didn't rush anyone. They didn't demand anything. They simply offered a way forward, letting people drift through the countryside at the calm pace of a thoughtful step. Before we begin this gentle journey through forgotten routes and the soothing world around them, if you enjoy these peaceful bedtime histories, don't forget to like the video. It truly helps the channel grow. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you never miss future slow, sleep-friendly stories. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever walked a road that felt quiet, peaceful, and somehow meaningful even though it didn't really lead anywhere? Your answers help shape the next episodes. Now, settle in, breathe slowly, and let us step together onto the peaceful old roads that led nowhere, yet somehow meant everything. In many parts of old Europe, long before towns grew into cities or maps became reliable tools, the land was crossed by paths that had no clear beginning and no certain end. They wound through forests, slipped behind hills, traced the edges of farms, and disappeared into stretches of countryside where nothing particular waited. To travelers accustomed to purposeful journeys, these roads might have seemed strange, gentle pathways that simply drifted onward without insisting that one destination mattered more than another. But for the people who lived in the quiet centuries of early Europe, these roads made perfect sense. They were not built to lead somewhere. They were built because someone, at some point, walked that way often enough to leave a suggestion behind. The story of these peaceful, unfinished roads begins not with planners, rulers, or grand designs, but with individuals who simply followed the land. A shepherd would walk across the same meadow season after season, guiding sheep through familiar spaces where grass grew soft and abundant. A farmer would travel from field to field, taking the gentlest route along the natural curves of the soil. A family might walk to a nearby grove to gather firewood, or to a stream to fetch water, following the terrain that felt easiest beneath their feet. Over time, these repeated movements pressed faint impressions into the landscape, shallow depressions that became paths, and paths that became roads. Most of these roads had no greater purpose than serving the daily routines of the people who used them. They followed short distances, connecting a village to a field, a herd to a pasture, or a household to a resource. But sometimes, these small paths joined with others, forming longer routes that stretched farther than anyone originally intended. When someone walked one of these longer paths, they often discovered that it curved unexpectedly, revealing more land, more sky, and more distance than imagined. And because it had no defined end, it invited further wandering. Travelers were not driven by urgency. They moved at a gentle pace, trusting the path to reveal itself step by step. One of the reasons these roads remained unfinished was that they were shaped by seasons. A path used in summer might be abandoned during winter. Another used during harvest might lose importance once the crops were gathered. Routes changed subtly each year as land shifted, as vegetation grew or receded, and as people adjusted their routines. This fluidity meant that many paths never solidified into formal roads. They stayed flexible, following the rhythm of daily life rather than the demands of trade or authority. Nature itself played a guiding role. In areas with rolling hills, paths curved around slopes rather than climbing them. In forests, they followed clearings rather than pushing through dense growth. Along rivers, they stayed close enough to benefit from the water's presence, but far enough to avoid frequent flooding. This natural logic gave the roads a peaceful, intuitive feel. They moved the way a person might move if they simply trusted their feet and the land to make decisions for them. Travelers walking these roads found themselves accompanied not by traffic or movement, but by silence. The silence was never empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of the countryside, the whisper of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the quiet hum of insects moving through grass. On these roads, a traveler was never hurried. They walked gently, adjusting their pace to the landscape, noticing details they might overlook on more structured routes. A stone partially embedded in earth, a cluster of wildflowers blooming by chance, a fallen branch creating a natural marker. All these subtle elements became part of the road's identity. Because the roads did not promise a destination, they encouraged presence rather than urgency. Travelers found themselves paying attention to the world around them, observing the way sunlight filtered through tree branches or how clouds drifted across wide stretches of sky. These paths created a rare form of travel, movement without pressure. They offered companionship with the land itself. Many of these peaceful roads existed on the edges of towns or between small settlements. They were not official routes maintained by anyone. They simply emerged from use. As villages grew, some of these paths connected households, forming soft boundaries between communal lands and private fields. People walked these routes for practical reasons, visiting friends, carrying tools, transporting goods in baskets or on simple carts. But even then, the roads retained their gentle, unhurried quality. They were never widened to accommodate large wagons, never paved, and seldom marked. They remained part of the natural world. One interesting feature of these roads was their ability to change direction over generations. A path used by one family might shift slightly if a new fence was built or if an old tree grew too wide. People adapted easily, walking around obstacles instead of straightening the road artificially. Over time, these small adjustments created pathways that felt organic, almost like streams shaped by years of patient flow. The roads curved and bent according to what felt right for the walkers, not according to any rigid design. Sometimes, these gentle roads connected unexpected places. A path that began near a quiet cottage might lead past a grove of trees, then dip into a meadow, then trace the edge of a forest before arriving at an old forgotten structure. A millstone no longer used a collapsed shed or a cluster of stones that once marked a boundary. These quiet destinations were not planned. They were simply the places where footsteps had paused long enough to leave traces. Villagers often knew these roads intimately. They could describe the way the light looked in one section during early morning, or how the breeze felt stronger near the bend where fields opened wide. They could recall where a path grew muddy after rain or where wild berries grew along the edges in summer. This familiarity created a relationship between people and the land that was deeply personal. The roads were not simply routes. They were part of the memory of the community. Stories sometimes grew around these paths, not because dramatic events occurred, but because the roads had been used for so long. People might say that their grandparents once walked the same route to reach a particular field. A household might mention that a certain turn in the road marked the boundary of old farm holdings. Another family might remember that generations ago, travelers used the path to reach a small gathering place where seasonal gatherings took place. These stories were gentle reminders that even quiet roads held significance through time. Perhaps most interesting was how these roads handled strangers. A traveler who stumbled upon one of these pathways might feel uncertain at first. After all, the road didn't seem to lead anywhere important. But as they walked along it, they would quickly sense the calmness of the space, the way the path moved naturally through the landscape, and the way it invited slow, thoughtful steps. Even strangers felt welcomed by the road's simplicity. Because the path was unclaimed and unhurried, it belonged to anyone who chose to walk it. These peaceful, unfinished roads also influenced the layout of towns. While main roads connected markets, bridges, and squares, the gentle paths shaped the outskirts, creating natural divisions between fields, forming shortcuts between small clusters of houses, or offering routes for those who preferred quiet walks over busy streets. Children used these roads to reach streams, small hills, or meadows where they played. Shepherds used them to guide flocks. Carpenters or potters used them to gather materials from nearby forests. Even the weather affected these roads in quiet ways. During rainy seasons, some paths softened into muddy tracks, prompting travelers to shift slightly to drier ground. Over time, these small adjustments became permanent, adding new layers to the road's shape. In winter, the snow smoothed everything. turning paths into gently carved lines of footsteps. In spring, plants reclaimed sections of unused routes, leaving only hints of where the road once lay. Because these roads had no official purpose, they were free to evolve. Some faded away entirely when a household moved or a field changed ownership. Others grew more pronounced as more people walked them. A few quiet roads eventually became the foundations for future streets, but many remained simply as they were, soft, winding traces guided by the land and by the human instinct to move at a gentle pace. As centuries passed, many of these peaceful roads disappeared, absorbed into modern developments, plowed into farmland, or reclaimed by forests. Yet fragments of them still survive. Hikers today sometimes stumble upon old paths hidden under layers of soil and leaves. Farmers discover faint depressions that hint at routes their ancestors once walked. And in older towns, small side streets still reflect the shape of these forgotten roads, their curves, their hesitations, their unwillingness to force a direct line. But even where the roads no longer exist physically, the idea of them endures. They remind us of a time when travel was calm, unhurried, and connected deeply to the land. A time when movement wasn't always about reaching a destination quickly, but about experiencing the road itself. A time when the world felt larger and quieter, and when a simple path leading to nowhere could still give someone a sense of peace, direction, and belonging. These forgotten roads weren't famous. They didn't appear on maps. They didn't shape empires or carry armies or define borders. But they shaped the everyday life of countless people across centuries. They were the routes of contemplation, gentle work, soft wandering, and quiet connection to the land. Their stories still whisper beneath the soil and in the curves of old fields. They remind us that sometimes the most meaningful journeys are not the ones that lead somewhere important, but the ones that move slowly through quiet spaces, asking nothing more than a moment of attention and a few peaceful steps. If we try to imagine the people who once walked the peaceful, unfinished roads of old Europe, it's easy to picture travelers in cloaks or merchants with goods. But the reality was gentler and far simpler. The majority of those who stepped onto these quiet paths were ordinary people: farmers, shepherds, artisans, foragers, families, wanderers, each moving slowly, guided not by grand purpose, but by the soft flow of daily life. Their footsteps, repeated over many years, gave form to the quiet roads that meant little to history on paper, yet meant everything to the small communities that relied on them. These travelers did not rush. They did not carry maps or chase distant horizons. Their journeys were shaped by practical needs, familiar tasks, and sometimes by simple curiosity. To understand these roads, we must understand the people who walked them, their routines, their thoughts, and the quiet motivations that filled their days. The first and most frequent travelers were farmers, whose work required them to move constantly between fields, barns, water sources, and storage areas. Many farms were scattered across patches of land rather than clustered in a single area. A farmer might walk from a home on one side of a hill to a patch of wheat on the other side, then to a grazing field, then to a small stream where tools were washed. Over time, the repetition of these routes carved the earliest versions of peaceful roads. Farmers walked patiently, noticing the soil beneath their feet, the condition of crops, the presence of birds, and the slow changes in weather. Their journeys were practical, but they carried a contemplative quality because farming itself required attention to the rhythms of nature. These roads became part of the farmer's lived landscape, shaped as much by observation as by movement. Another group of quiet travelers were shepherds, whose livelihoods depended on leading their flocks to suitable grazing areas. Unlike farmers, shepherds moved with animals and stayed aware of the land's subtle cues: fresh grass, clear water, safe resting spots. Their steps were guided by the needs of the flock rather than by direct routes. This wandering, patient movement created long, narrow paths that curved with the terrain. Shepherds spent hours walking slowly across meadows and hillsides, often alone with their thoughts. They followed familiar routes not because they were marked, but because the land had taught them which directions felt right. Over centuries, these shepherding routes became some of the gentlest and most scenic roads in Europe, winding through landscapes shaped entirely by slow footsteps and grazing animals. There were also craftsmen and artisans who needed materials from specific places: wood from forests, clay from riverbanks, reeds from wetlands, stones from quarries. Their journeys created roads that connected natural resources to small workshops. A potter might walk the same path every week, carrying clay in a basket balanced on one shoulder. A carpenter might follow a shaded route to reach a grove with sturdy timber. A weaver might walk to a field where certain plants grew, gathering fibers for dyeing or weaving. These workers didn't need grand routes. They needed reliable access. Their repeated journeys transformed narrow tracks into soft roads that wound between the natural and the human-made. Entire families used these peaceful pathways as well. Children walked with parents to nearby fields, water sources, forests, or hamlets. They learned the land slowly, observing the shapes of hills, the bends of streams, and the way light played across different slopes. These early experiences shaped their understanding of home, not as a single location, but as a landscape tied together by gentle paths. When children grew older, they retraced these roads instinctively, connecting their childhood memories to practical adult responsibilities. There were also women who moved between households, bringing food, sharing supplies, or assisting with chores. In many villages, these social visits were essential to community life. The roads they walked were often lined with wildflowers, small shrubs, or uneven stones. They carried baskets filled with bread, cloth, herbs, or small tools. Their footsteps gave the roads an element of care, soft, regular movements that reinforced the connection between homes and families. Some travelers walked not out of duty, but out of need for quiet moments away from noise. These were the wanderers of ordinary life, people who sought a bit of calm, a break from work, or a chance to think. They didn't go far. They simply followed paths that led into nature. Many of these individuals found comfort in walking a familiar road that held no requirements. The simple act of stepping onto a quiet path, breathing steadily, and observing the land provided a form of rest that required no explanation. They walked slowly, sometimes pausing to inspect plants, stones, or small creatures. These calm wanderings strengthened the character of the road, giving it a rhythm shaped by reflection. Another group included seasonal workers, people who traveled from one region to another during harvest periods or periods of field preparation. Their routes weren't always direct. They often followed old paths that connected villages loosely. These workers carried tools wrapped in cloth, small bundles of food, and occasionally musical instruments that shaped the quiet evenings during rest. Because they moved in small numbers and without urgency, they blended seamlessly into the peaceful roads. Their presence added a sense of shared purpose, even though each traveler walked independently. There was also a category of quiet travelers who rarely appear in official records, messengers of daily life. These individuals weren't part of formal systems. They were ordinary villagers who carried small messages for neighbors or relatives. They walked between houses or settlements, delivering news about gatherings, births, weather changes, or communal tasks. Their role was not dramatic, but it strengthened social ties. The roads they used often became known for reliability, simply because messengers walked them consistently. These paths, though small, knit together countless aspects of community life. Even animals contributed to the formation of these roads. Cows walking to grazing pastures, horses led to watering areas, goats searching for shrubs. All followed natural instincts that carved gentle tracks into the land. Humans often adopted these animal-made paths because they aligned with natural contours, avoiding steep climbs or dense thickets. Thus, the movements of animals created some of the earliest roads to nowhere, guiding humans along comfortable routes shaped by instinct rather than intention. Perhaps the most contemplative travelers were those who walked simply to observe the world, a practice so common in old Europe that it blended seamlessly into daily routine. People stepped onto these quiet roads when they needed space to think, after long workdays, before making decisions, or while experiencing moments of uncertainty. The peaceful roads offered privacy without isolation, allowing travelers to feel connected to the land while processing their thoughts gently. Walking these paths became an unspoken form of mental rest, as steady footsteps matched the slow pulse of the natural world. Importantly, the roads shaped the travelers just as much as the travelers shaped the roads. People who walked these paths learned patience. They learned to navigate by intuition, observing small markers like a leaning tree, a cluster of stones, or the bend of a stream. They learned to trust the land, recognizing that even a road without a destination could provide direction simply by existing. These skills became part of the cultural fabric of many communities, passed down from one generation to the next, forming the subtle wisdom of local life. Travelers also learned to read the weather through these roads. A familiar path revealed shifts in soil moisture, wind patterns, or cloud movement. On warm days, the land felt expansive, encouraging longer walks. On cooler or misty days, the road carried a sense of intimacy, as though the world had pulled a gentle blanket over itself. These sensory experiences shaped how people related to the environment and how they understood seasonal cycles. Because these quiet roads welcomed such diverse walkers, farmers, shepherds, artisans, families, wanderers, they became the meeting ground for different experiences. Travelers often encountered one another, exchanging soft words or polite nods. These brief interactions strengthened the sense of community. Even strangers felt connected through the shared act of walking the same peaceful route. Conversations rarely lasted long, but they offered a small, meaningful reminder that life in old Europe was interconnected through slow, steady movement. The roads also influenced how people planned their days. A quiet path might be used more frequently at dawn, when the world was still cool and birds were waking. Another might be most active during late afternoon, when the sunlight softened and shadows lengthened. Travelers learned these rhythms naturally, adjusting their routines to the road's character. This relationship between the traveler and the road created a comforting sense of predictability. Seasonal rhythms shaped travel as well. In spring, roads were lined with new growth, small flowers, fresh grass, and bright foliage. Travelers felt energized by the renewal. In summer, roads offered shade in forested sections and open warmth in meadows. Walkers moved slowly, resting often. Autumn painted the roads with leaves, turning each step into a soft rustling sound. Travelers carried harvest goods or prepared fields for winter. And in winter, the roads quieted even further, becoming soft under snow or firm under frost. Each season added new textures, sounds, and experiences, making the road feel alive. Despite their simplicity, these roads were essential for emotional well-being. Walking them offered balance, helping people process their day, clear their thoughts, and reconnect with a landscape they deeply understood. In a time long before entertainment or rapid travel, these roads provided a form of gentle escape, the chance to immerse oneself in the steady pace of nature. Many travelers walked these roads knowing they led nowhere important, yet returned again and again. The value of the road wasn't in its destination. It was in the experience of walking it. These paths offered a kind of companionship that no bustling market street or formal road could provide. They connected people to the land, to themselves, and to one another. Even today, when many of these routes have faded, their spirit remains. People still seek quiet paths, still take slow walks to clear their minds, still appreciate the gentle feeling of moving without pressure or urgency. Modern trails echo the instinctual wisdom of these ancient roads, reminding us that human beings have always found comfort in slow, thoughtful movement. The peaceful roads that once led nowhere carried generations of quiet travelers, people who walked not to arrive, but to experience. They shaped the land through footsteps, shaped communities through connection, and shaped history through the soft, steady rhythm of daily life. Their journeys may not have changed the world on a grand scale, but they left gentle imprints that still whisper through the landscapes of Europe today. When we imagine an old European road, especially one that led quietly to nowhere in particular, it's tempting to picture a simple dirt track winding through fields. But the truth is far richer. These peaceful roads were shaped by countless forces: earth, wind, water, footsteps, seasons, and even the moods of the land itself. They were not constructed as much as they were discovered, formed through use rather than intention. Their shapes told stories about the people who walked them, the land they crossed, and the centuries of quiet rhythm that molded their existence. To understand these roads, one must first understand the soil beneath them. Much of Europe's countryside is a gentle mixture of earth types, each behaving differently under pressure. Clay soil, when walked upon repeatedly, tightens and hardens, forming narrow, smooth tracks that resist erosion. Sandy soils respond differently, shifting slightly with each step, creating soft edges and gentle slopes. Loamy soil retains moisture, giving paths a firm but slightly springy feel after rain. These qualities dictated the early shape of each road. A shepherd walking over clay would create a well-defined line, while travelers on sandy ground created broad, blurred paths that could shift slightly with each season. The texture of these surfaces shaped how people experienced the roads. When one walked upon clay, footsteps made a quiet, solid sound, almost like tapping on a flattened drum. On sandy paths, the sound softened to a muted crunch. On grassy routes, footsteps became nearly silent. This interplay of textures contributed to the calmness of the roads. There was no jarring noise, no clatter, only soft, natural sounds that blended with the surrounding environment. In many places, the road's edges were defined not by markers or fences, but by vegetation. Grass grew taller farther from the path, forming gentle borders. Wildflowers found space along the sides, blooming seasonally and coloring the road's edges with soft yellows, purples, or whites. Small shrubs thrived where footsteps rarely touched. The result was a corridor of nature where plants framed the track without constraining it. They did not dictate the road, they simply accompanied it. Trees also played an important role. In forests, paths naturally formed where the spacing between trunks allowed easy movement. Some roads followed natural clearings created by fallen trees or old lightning strikes. Others curved around large roots or angled gently toward clusters of saplings. Travelers learned to weave through these patterns without forcing straight lines. This gave the roads their signature curves, soft, slow bends that matched the forest contours. Even outside the woods, lone trees often stood as natural guardians beside the road, offering shade in summer and shelter from wind in winter. Water shaped the roads just as much as earth and plants. Rainfall created temporary streams that influenced where people walked. In muddy seasons, travelers shifted slightly to drier ground, creating parallel tracks that gradually became part of the road's design. Shallow ditches formed alongside many paths, not through human planning, but through water finding its course. These tiny channels protected the roads by diverting runoff. In open landscapes, dew settled on the path in early mornings, adding a cool shimmer that evaporated slowly as the sun rose. Walkers felt the soft dampness underfoot, giving the road a delicate texture that changed throughout the day. In some regions, centuries of footsteps pressed stones deeper into the earth. Larger rocks were pushed to the sides, forming natural borders. Smaller stones compacted into a mosaic-like surface. These stone-laced sections created firm footing and reflected sunlight differently than earthy portions. On warm afternoons, these mixed surfaces glowed gently, creating a pleasant visual contrast against surrounding grass. The width of these roads varied naturally. Paths walked by only one or two people remained narrow, just wide enough for a single traveler. Over time, passing shepherds or families created small expansions, but the road never grew wider than necessary. In places where carts occasionally traveled, the road widened slightly to accommodate wheels, but even these broader sections retained their quiet character. Since traffic was infrequent and slow, the surface never developed the deep grooves or harsh lines seen in more commercial routes. Elevation influenced road shape as well. In hilly regions, roads traced the gentlest slopes, avoiding steep ascents. They zigzagged naturally, breaking climbs into manageable sections. This created peaceful curves that guided travelers gradually upward. On descents, paths often followed natural erosion channels, creating soft, descending waves that moved gently through the land. In flat regions, the road stretched more linearly but still curved slightly to avoid marshy patches, dense vegetation, or uneven soil. Because these roads were shaped not by design, but by centuries of subtle decision-making, they developed an organic beauty that straight, engineered roads could never achieve. Each bend existed for a reason, whether to avoid a tree, skirt a pond, or follow ease of movement. Travelers intuitively understood the logic. When walking these paths, one rarely felt lost. The road seemed to know where it wanted to go, even if where it ended didn't matter. Roads also carried the imprint of weather across generations. Sunlight bleached the upper layers of soil, creating pale patches. Shade from nearby trees preserved darker tones. Wind swept dust along open stretches, smoothing them into soft curves. Heavy snow compacted tracks, freezing them into temporary firmness that influenced how the path felt in early spring. Over decades, these recurring patterns shaped the road's texture and personality. The microclimates along the road were noticeable too. In forested sections, the air felt cooler, carrying the scent of pine, leaves, or wet bark. In open meadows, the warmth of the sun dominated, accompanied by the rustle of tall grasses. Along streams, the humidity increased slightly, giving the road a refreshing feel. Each of these atmospheric changes created landmarks that travelers remembered, not physical markers, but sensory ones. Light played a surprisingly important role in shaping the identity of these roads. Morning sunshine filtered softly through trees, casting long shadows across the path. The angled light illuminated small details, tiny stones, insect trails, remnants of animal footprints that might go unnoticed at other times of day. Midday light was stronger, revealing the full breadth of the road and making every curve visible. Evening light softened the world again, creating long, gentle shadows and giving the road a golden tone that felt serene and nostalgic. At night, the roads adopted an entirely different character. Moonlight created faint glimmers along pale soil and highlighted the edges of stones. Stars reflected in puddles after rain. These quiet nighttime roads, though seldom used, carried their own tranquility. The air cooled, the land rested, and the road felt like a sleeping companion beneath the vast sky. These roads also shaped how people interacted with the landscape emotionally. Because the paths were gentle and predictable, travelers felt comfortable exploring them. There was a sense of freedom without risk, a rare combination. People trusted these roads because they had been shaped by generations of footsteps. They felt grounded, familiar, and steady. Even when the road led nowhere specific, travelers followed it with confidence, knowing that familiarity lived in every curve. The boundaries between the road and the surrounding land were fluid. Animals often wandered across the path. Plants crept in during summer and retreated in winter. After storms, branches might fall across the road. Travelers simply stepped around them, gently nudging the path in a new direction. When fields expanded or houses shifted slightly, the road adapted. This flexibility meant that the roads aged gracefully. They never felt outdated because they never belonged to any fixed design. Time deepened the road's character. As centuries passed, the soil compacted further. Edges grew smoother. Vegetation learned its limits. Stones settled more comfortably. A path that may have once been uneven or unpredictable gradually mellowed into a stable, welcoming route. Travelers stepping onto such a road centuries later could feel the weight of history, not in any dramatic sense, but in the subtle assurance that countless footsteps had walked the same ground. The peacefulness of these roads came partly from their purpose, or rather, their lack of strict purpose. A road leading nowhere important carries no tension, no urgency, no narrow expectation. It invites slow walking, observation, contemplation. It gives travelers permission to pause, to rest, to think gently, to let their minds wander. The road becomes a companion rather than a taskmaster. Even today, remnants of these soft roads can be felt, sometimes as faint tracks along fields, sometimes as small footpaths beside forests, sometimes as narrowed lanes inside villages. Modern life may no longer depend on these paths, but their memory lingers. Landscape historians can see their traces in maps. Farmers recognize them when plowing. Hikers notice them when the terrain unexpectedly reveals a familiar curve that seems too deliberate to be random. These are the faint ghosts of old roads, still whispering their stories through the land. In many ways, the roads themselves were living elements. They changed with seasons, adapted to needs, grew with generations, and held the quiet companionship of those who walked them. They formed naturally, guided by the softness of human movement rather than the rigidity of human planning. And because of this, they became some of the calmest, most peaceful creations in history, unintentional masterpieces of collective footsteps. These roads remind us that not all important paths lead to destinations. Some lead inward, to reflection, to understanding, to connection with nature, to a sense of peace that arises simply from walking. Their shapes were the result of not one decision, but thousands of tiny choices made by ordinary people over centuries. To walk gently, to follow the easiest slope, to avoid disturbing the land, to move in harmony with the world around them. And so these peaceful roads, shaped by earth, weather, footsteps, and time, continue to live quietly in memory. Their softness, their curves, their natural logic, all invite us to remember that sometimes the most meaningful routes are the ones that never demanded anything from us except that we walk slowly, breathe deeply, and allow the land to guide us. To truly understand the peaceful roads that once stretched quietly across old Europe, it is not enough to focus on the paths themselves. One must also understand the world that embraced them. The trees whose roots shaped their edges, the fields that opened beside them like soft green oceans, the hills that guided their curves, the breezes that whispered along their length, and the animals that treated these roads not as human creations, but as natural parts of the land. These roads were not isolated features. They lived in harmony with the environment, becoming as much a part of nature as the landscapes they crossed. When someone walked one of these gentle roads centuries ago, they were not simply moving along a path. They were moving through an ecosystem that changed with every step. The road might begin under a canopy of trees, move into a bright meadow, skirt the edge of a river, rise onto a low hill, and then vanish into a patch of woodland again. Each section offered its own atmosphere, its own sounds, its own small wonders that unfolded quietly, inviting travelers to slow their pace and breathe in the world around them. Trees were among the most influential companions to these roads. In many regions, oak and beech trees grew thickly near the edges of pathways, creating long corridors of filtered sunlight. Their roots shaped the soil beneath, sometimes revealing themselves as knotted ridges that travelers stepped over with practiced ease. These trees offered shade in summer and gentle shelter from rain in early spring. When winds blew, their leaves rustled like soft conversation, creating a soothing background sound that followed travelers for long stretches. In forested regions, paths wound naturally around the largest trees, following spaces where the ground was clearest. Older trees, whose trunks had grown wide over centuries, often created natural arches above the path. Moss grew along their bark, softening their surfaces and giving the forest a deep, quiet atmosphere. Travelers walking through these shaded sections felt enclosed in a world that existed independently of human activity. The road was simply a guest in an ancient environment governed by its own slow rhythms. Meadows offered a completely different experience. When paths emerged from forests, travelers found themselves bathed in open sunlight. Grass swayed gently, creating waves that shimmered under the breeze. Birds drifted above in slow patterns, sometimes dipping to inspect the movement below. Wildflowers dotted the edges of the path, poppies, daisies, clover, adding soft bursts of color that changed with the seasons. In late spring and early summer, meadows hummed with life. Bees moved methodically between blooms. Butterflies rested on warm stones. Even the smallest movement felt part of a peaceful choreography. The smell of meadows varied subtly throughout the year. In spring, the air carried the scent of new growth, sharp, fresh, and bright. In summer, the smell softened into warm grass and sweet flowers. In autumn, as plants dried and prepared for the cold, the meadow carried a faint earthy scent that signaled the end of the growing season. These scents drifted across the roads, becoming part of the traveler's memory of the path. Streams and rivers played a gentle role in shaping the environment of the roads. Many paths followed waterways because they offered reliable guides. Humans and animals alike trusted the logic of water, which carved its way through the landscape with quiet persistence. The sound of running water accompanied travelers, sometimes as a soft trickle and other times as a fuller, steadier flow. The air felt cooler near these sections, carrying moisture that softened the road's surface. Plants grew lushly here: ferns, reeds, willow trees dipping their branches toward the water. The path tightened slightly near riverbanks, becoming narrow and intimate, as if inviting the traveler to stay close to the calming sounds of the current. On higher ground, where rivers thinned into smaller streams or disappeared into underground channels, the roads followed the contours of hills. These elevated paths offered travelers long views, the shapes of nearby forests, the patterns of farmland, the distant lines of roads barely visible against the earth. On clear days, travelers could see smoke rising from small villages or the faint outline of another hill far away. These vantage points made the world feel wide and open. The wind was stronger here, carrying scents of distant fields or forests. Even the soundscape changed, wind sweeping through tall grasses, the faint call of birds riding the air currents, or the rustling of shrubs that clung to rocky soil. Animals moved freely around these roads, treating them not as boundaries, but as familiar features within their territory. Deer often crossed quietly in early mornings or late evenings, the softness of their footsteps blending into the natural texture of the road. Foxes trotted along sections of the path, using it as a convenient route just as humans did. Hares hid in tall grass, darting out suddenly when startled. Birds perched on branches, scanning the landscape for insects or seeds. In some regions, shepherds reported seeing wild boar tracks or the markings of other creatures who shared the land. Travelers walking these roads learned to recognize animal signs. A cluster of feathers might indicate a bird's resting place. Fresh tracks in mud might show that a deer had passed only moments before. Scratches on tree bark hinted at animals sharpening their claws or marking territory. These clues were not merely observations. They were part of the silent dialogue between people and nature, teaching travelers to understand the roads in a deeper, more intuitive way. Weather played one of the most profound roles in shaping the atmosphere of these peaceful paths. On bright days, sunlight gave the roads a warm, inviting glow. Shadows fell softly across the ground, creating moving patterns that followed travelers as they walked. Warm breezes carried the scent of soil, flowers, and leaves, making the road feel comforting and alive. On cloudy days, the world became quieter. Overcast skies muted the colors of the landscape, turning greens into deeper tones and washing the road in soft gray light. Travelers walking in such conditions often felt a sense of introspection, as though the subdued atmosphere encouraged reflection. The soft light made distances feel closer, the air heavier, but in a calming way. Rain transformed the roads with gentle insistence. Light rain created a subtle pattering sound, softened by leaves or the earth. Footsteps on wet soil produced a rich, grounding sound, less crisp than dry days, but somehow more soothing. Rain brought with it the scent of damp earth, fresh leaves, and cooled stones. Travelers walking in these conditions often slowed their pace, not out of difficulty, but because the world felt quieter, the road more intimate, and time less pressing. After rain, the roads carried a distinct energy. Puddles reflected pieces of sky. Earth darkened in tone, revealing intricate patterns in the soil. Plants seemed greener, more vibrant. Birds reappeared, shaking water from their wings. The world felt newly cleansed, as though the road and its surroundings had taken a deep breath. Snow was perhaps the quietest companion of all. A snow-covered road nearly erased its own existence, smoothing edges and softening distinctions between path and land. Footsteps created a muted crunch, and the world felt insulated from sound. Trees bore delicate layers of white. Fields became wide blankets of calm. The stillness was profound, offering travelers a rare kind of solitude that blended peace with introspection. Even animals moved differently through snow, leaving distinct tracks that told brief stories of movement. Fog added another dimension. Mist settled along low paths in early morning, wrapping the world in a soft, white veil. Travelers could see only a few meters ahead, making each step feel personal and immediate. Trees emerged like silhouettes. Streams appeared suddenly, their surfaces glassy and quiet. Time felt slower in fog, as though the world had narrowed its focus to the small stretch of road directly beneath one's feet. The landscape surrounding these roads shaped not only what people saw, but what they felt. Walking through forests brought a sense of enclosure and safety. Meadows brought openness and warmth. Hills brought perspective and contemplation. Rivers offered companionship through sound. Each environment contributed to the mental state of travelers, creating pathways not just through land, but through experience. These roads also formed boundaries between different types of land. A path might mark the edge of a field, separating cultivated soil from wild growth. Another might separate meadow from forest, creating a gentle transition between open and enclosed spaces. These boundaries were not strict, they blended naturally, but they helped travelers understand the landscape intuitively. Because the environment around the roads was so richly textured, travelers learned to move with awareness. They could sense changes in soil through their feet, smell shifts in the air, hear distant signals carried by the wind. A change in bird song might indicate a nearby clearing. A faint sound of running water hinted at a stream just beyond the next bend. A sudden coolness meant the path was approaching shade. These sensory cues created a deeper connection with the land, allowing travelers to feel at home even in unfamiliar places. One of the most remarkable qualities of these roads was their ability to calm the mind. Surrounded by natural beauty, filled with soft sounds and changing light, they offered a form of relaxation that came not from stopping, but from moving gently. The steady rhythm of walking, combined with the environment's quiet signals, encouraged a meditative state. Thoughts drifted easily. Worry softened. The land's slow pulse helped steady the traveler's own. Because of this, the roads became places of reflection even for people who did not intend them to be. A farmer returning from a field might find clarity about a task. A shepherd guiding animals might find comfort in the repetition of steps. A child exploring the path might experience a sense of wonder that shaped their memory of home. The road became more than a route. It became a companion. And all the while, the landscape remained patient. Trees grew slowly. Hills endured. Streams shifted their banks inch by inch. Seasons rotated through predictable cycles. The environment asked nothing of travelers except that they acknowledge its presence. In return, it offered calm, connection, and continuity. This relationship between the peaceful roads and the world around them is what gave these paths their character. They were not roads built against nature. They were roads shaped alongside it. Nature was not an obstacle. It was a collaborator. The landscape guided the road gently, and the road offered travelers a way to experience the landscape deeply. Even today, when fragments of these roads survive, the surrounding environment still carries their memory. A narrow line through a forest, a faint track beside a meadow, a slightly sunken stretch in an open field. These remnants still whisper of the partnership between path and landscape. They remind us that some of the most beautiful journeys in history took place not on grand highways, but on quiet, unplanned roads embraced by nature. These peaceful roads lived in a world where time moved slowly, seasons shaped everything, and the land offered companionship rather than challenge. And although they led nowhere in particular, they led people into moments of stillness, attention, and gentle connection with the world around them. A journey valuable not for its destination, but for the quiet experience of simply walking. As we continue exploring the peaceful roads that led to nowhere, it becomes clear that the paths themselves were only part of the story. The world around them was not filled with grand monuments or dramatic structures. Instead, the roads were accompanied by small, quiet places, simple features of the landscape that offered rest, guidance, or subtle hints of human presence. These small places shaped how travelers experienced their journeys, giving each road a personality defined not by its destination, but by the moments encountered along the way. One of the most common features along these gentle roads was the old well. In many European regions, wells were placed wherever fresh groundwater was accessible, and these wells often became natural meeting points for travelers. Some wells were simple holes lined with stones to prevent collapse. Others were slightly more elaborate, with low circular walls built from carefully stacked rocks. A wooden bucket, worn by years of use, might rest nearby, while the rope used for drawing water grew rough from friction. Travelers walking the road would pause at these wells, filling small containers, washing dust from their hands, or splashing their faces before continuing. The well did not belong to any one person. It served everyone who passed. Over time, the presence of such a well gave the road its own quiet identity, a place where people stopped not because they had reached somewhere important, but because the road gently invited them to rest. Another common sight along these roads was the abandoned mill, often found near small streams. Many of these mills were no longer functional by the time travelers encountered them. Their wooden wheels stood still, covered in moss. The stone foundations remained strong, though softened by years of rain and wind. Inside, Old grinding stones might rest at an angle, leaning like tired workers taking a long, deserved pause. These mills were built in eras when small communities depended on them for grain processing. But as villages shifted or families moved away, some mills were left behind. Travelers found them peaceful. They provided shade on sunny days, a place to sit, and a sense of being surrounded by history so quiet it asked nothing in return. The mill did not call travelers to work or duty. It simply stood there, a reminder of the lives once lived along the same road. Footbridges were also frequent companions to the roads, especially where small creeks crossed the landscape. Some bridges were made of a single tree trunk carved flat on one side. Others were constructed of rough planks supported by stone at both ends. These bridges often creaked underfoot, but carried a comforting familiarity. Travelers trusted them because generations had walked across the same planks. Moss and algae grew along the edges where water splashed up during rain, and soft mud collected at the base where boots and hooves pressed the soil. The bridges existed not as engineering achievements, but as practical, humble connections between one piece of land and another. Walking across them, one felt the gentle transition between landscapes, marked by the quiet sound of flowing water below. Sometimes, the most subtle features were the most meaningful. Stone markers, small piles of rocks built by travelers, often appeared at forks or along confusing stretches of the road. These cairns were not official signs. They held no engraved messages. Their meaning lay in their presence, a simple reassurance that others had walked this way before. Travelers added stones as a sign of respect or gratitude. Some markers grew tall over generations. Others remained small, barely noticeable unless one looked closely. These piles of stones represented human cooperation at its most understated. A quiet gesture passed from one walker to the next. Other markers were natural, large boulders smoothed by time, leaning slightly like old guardians of the path. Some were covered in lichen or surrounded by patches of low-growing flowers. These stones offered more than direction. They created rhythm. A traveler might remember that after a certain stone, the path would drift left, or that a particularly tall rock marked the beginning of a meadow. The stones became waypoints not through design, but through familiarity. Occasionally, travelers encountered small huts or shelters built long ago by shepherds or seasonal workers. These shelters were simple, wooden or stone structures with gaps that allowed wind to pass through. Inside, there might be a crude bench made from split logs or an old fire circle showing signs of occasional use. These huts were not homes. They were temporary havens where one could rest during sudden rain or take refuge from cold winds. The presence of such a shelter, even if rarely used, made the road feel more hospitable. Travelers felt comfort in knowing that someone, at some point in history, had cared enough to leave a place of rest for others. Farther along the roads, especially near forests or high meadows, travelers might stumble upon tiny workshops that once served lone craftsmen. Woodworkers who carved handles and tools, weavers who collected natural fibers, or tanners who worked hides near clean water sources. These workshops, like the mills, sometimes fell into quiet abandonment as generations passed. A wooden beam might lean against a wall, long unused. A rusted frame that once held a spinning wheel might rest silently in a corner. Ivy crept over the structure, blending it into the landscape. These places carried an atmosphere of gentle stillness, evidence of work once done carefully and patiently. Travelers passing by felt as though they had stepped into the lingering memory of a craft. These small features, wells, mills, bridges, markers, huts, workshops, did more than decorate the road. They shaped how the road felt. A traveler walking along a quiet path might notice how the environment changed subtly as each feature appeared. The road did not change direction because of official planning. It evolved around these structures naturally. A path that adjusted slightly to avoid a well or curved gently toward a footbridge felt like a road that understood human needs instinctively. Perhaps the most peaceful of all features were the open spaces that appeared unexpectedly. Fields where the grass grew slightly shorter because animals grazed their clearings, and forests where sunlight pooled like warm water, or gentle slopes where the land dipped before rising again. These places invited travelers to pause, not because they had reached a destination, but because the land itself offered a moment of calm. A breeze might sweep across such a clearing, carrying scents from distant fields. Birds might cluster in branches above, creating the background music of ordinary life. A traveler could sit on a smooth stone, watch insects move through grass, and feel as though time had stretched slightly to accommodate a few quiet minutes. These peaceful roads were filled with such small gifts, details that went unnoticed by anyone in a hurry, yet meant everything to those who walked slowly. Even the smallest things held meaning. A fallen branch shaped like a gentle curve might become a familiar sight. A shallow puddle that reflected the sky after rain might be remembered as a mirror of seasons. Travelers, especially those who walked the same road frequently, built relationships with these tiny landmarks. Animals, too, played a part in defining these spaces. Birds made nests in old beams of abandoned huts. Butterflies rested on the warm surfaces of stone markers. Sheep grazed near wells or beneath old trees. Dogs from nearby cottages sometimes wandered onto the road, greeting travelers with friendly curiosity before returning home. Even small, unnoticed creatures, beetles, ants, frogs, contributed to the sense of life around the road. Their presence enriched the environment quietly, reminding travelers that they were sharing the space with many forms of life. Some roads had features that indicated older histories. An ancient stump covered in moss might be the remnant of a tree that once served as a resting place for generations. A shallow depression in the ground could indicate where earth had been dug out centuries earlier. A row of stones hidden beneath grass might be the remains of an old fence. These fragments, though subtle, connected the present traveler to people long gone. They showed how the landscape had evolved, absorbing and transforming the efforts of previous generations. In certain areas, travelers encountered low walls or terraces built by farmers to manage erosion or separate plots of land. Over time, these stone lines softened, sinking into the earth until they seemed part of the natural terrain. But their presence told a quiet story about human agriculture, work done carefully, patiently, with an understanding of the land's needs. Walking along these stretches, one could sense the connection between human hands and the earth, a relationship that shaped the road indirectly. Even environmental sounds became features of the road. The creak of an old mill wheel during windy weather, the trickle of a nearby stream, the steady hum of insects in summer, or the rustle of dry leaves in autumn all contributed to the road's atmosphere. Travelers learned to anticipate these sounds. A familiar noise could signal where they were on the path, much like a modern traveler might recognize a landmark. These roads also taught travelers patience. With no urgent destination ahead, every small feature became something to appreciate. A traveler might spend several minutes examining the smooth surface of a stone near a well, noticing the subtle lines carved by time. Another might sit by a wooden footbridge, dangling feet over the edge, watching water drift by. Someone walking at dusk might stop to admire the soft orange glow that bathed an old workshop, making its weathered wood look warm and alive. In this way, the road itself became an experience, a series of gentle moments woven together by footsteps. Travelers began to understand that meaning did not come from reaching the end of the path. It came from the journey itself, shaped by all the small places encountered along the way. The well offered refreshment. The mill offered shade. The bridge offered transition. The stone markers offered reassurance. The shelters offered protection. The clearings offered rest. These simple elements turned the road into a companion, one that walked alongside the traveler, not ahead of them. Even today, when many of these features have vanished, their memory lingers in the land. A slight dip in the forest floor might be all that remains of an old footbridge. A circle of stones might hint at a forgotten well. A shape hidden in tall grass might be part of a collapsed hut. These remnants remind us that quiet roads were once full of life, not dramatic or loud, but gentle, steady, and meaningful. And although the small places along the roads may have faded, the lessons they offered remain. Sometimes the places that mean the most are the ones we encounter unexpectedly, the ones that offer rest without asking for anything in return, and the ones that shape our journey not through their size, but through their quiet presence. Walking one of the peaceful roads that led to nowhere in particular meant more than simply moving through a quiet landscape. These paths, despite their remote and unhurried nature, were not empty. People crossed them every day, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in small groups. And although the roads themselves did not lead to grand destinations, they served as soft threads that connected individuals, villages, and generations through countless small encounters. These meetings were rarely dramatic. They did not involve great decisions or important exchanges. Instead, they were calm, polite, almost invisible moments of connection that shaped the emotional landscape of the road just as much as the trees, streams, and meadows did. When a traveler stepped onto one of these quiet paths, there was always a chance of meeting someone else walking in the opposite direction or catching up from behind. The etiquette of such meetings was simple and gentle. People would greet each other with a nod, a soft "good day," or a brief smile. The greetings were never loud. Voices blended with the environment, becoming part of the natural soundscape. Even the tone of these interactions felt shaped by the road itself, calm, humble, and unhurried. One of the most common encounters involved farmers moving between their fields. They often walked with tools, simple hoes, rakes, or baskets, balanced over their shoulders. When they met a traveler, they did not stop long. They offered a small greeting and continued. Yet even these brief interactions carried warmth. A farmer might mention the weather, noting how the wind was shifting or how the soil felt underfoot that morning. These remarks were not attempts at conversation. They were acknowledgments of shared experience. Both individuals understood the land, the seasons, and the rhythm of work. These small exchanges created a quiet bond between strangers who might never learn each other's names. Another group one might meet along the road were shepherds guiding their flocks. When a flock approached, the road took on a temporary life of its own. The soft sounds of hooves patted the path. Sheep clustered naturally along the edges, grazing as they moved. Shepherds, walking with staffs or guiding dogs, greeted travelers calmly. They sometimes paused long enough to let the flock pass, offering travelers room to step aside. These moments were accompanied by the light bleating of animals, the brushing of wool against tall grass, and the low calls of the shepherd's dog. The road felt briefly alive with motion, yet none of it disrupted the overall peace. Instead, it added depth to the landscape, reminding travelers that even a road leading nowhere could hold an entire scene of life within a single moment. Children, too, were common travelers. They ran small errands, bringing food to a family member in the fields, fetching water from a well, or visiting neighbors in nearby hamlets. Their steps were lighter, their voices a little brighter, yet they still carried the same softness that defined the road. When they crossed paths with adults, they bowed their heads in shy greeting or offered a quick smile before continuing. Sometimes children walked in small groups, chatting quietly or carrying small bundles. Their presence brought a sense of continuity to the road, as though each generation inherited the path's calm spirit and passed it naturally to the next. There were also older travelers, men and women who walked the roads out of habit, comfort, or simple routine. They moved slowly, leaning on walking sticks or placing each foot carefully on the uneven ground. Their pace matched the road's natural rhythm. When they met others, they often exchanged longer greetings, not out of urgency, but because age had given them patience. They commented on familiar landmarks, remembering how a tree had grown or how a bridge had once looked. They sometimes shared small stories about the past, fragments of memory that floated gently into conversation. Travelers listening to these stories felt privileged, as though the road itself had chosen to reveal a bit of its history through someone who had walked it for many decades. One of the most peaceful encounters came from meeting gatherers and foragers, people collecting herbs, mushrooms, berries, or firewood. These individuals worked quietly, aware of the land's subtle signs. They often noticed travelers before travelers noticed them. A gentle rustle in bushes, a soft movement of leaves, or the faint sound of a basket brushing against branches would reveal their presence. When they stepped onto the path, they greeted travelers with the calm confidence of those deeply familiar with the woods. Their baskets carried the scents of the forest, moss, bark, fresh leaves, and added another sensory layer to the experience of the road. Sometimes travelers met craftsmen carrying small loads of tools or materials. A potter transporting clay, a carpenter carrying wood, or a weaver bringing dyed threads to a workshop. These workers often moved with focused purpose, but they still embodied the same quiet courtesy as everyone else. A simple greeting, a small nod, maybe a brief remark about their task. That was all. Their presence reminded travelers that work and movement were deeply connected on these roads, not in a hurried or pressured way, but through quiet necessity. There were also traveling peddlers, though rarely the kind who shouted or drew crowds. The ones who walked these peaceful roads were modest individuals carrying small collections of goods, wooden spoons, simple cloths, herbs, or hand-carved items. They did not aim to reach large markets. Instead, they traveled between small communities, offering items needed for daily life. Their conversations with travelers were practical, soft-spoken, and respectful. They might exchange information about the conditions of the road, the weather ahead, or whether a bridge had recently been repaired by locals. These small exchanges made the road feel like part of a larger network, even if it didn't lead anywhere grand. One of the most touching types of encounters involved neighbors walking together. These pairs or small groups often traveled side by side, carrying baskets, tools, or simply enjoying each other's company. Their conversations were quiet, filled with casual remarks about their households, their routines, or changes in the land. Travelers meeting them sensed the closeness between them. The road provided a space for these gentle interactions, allowing people to strengthen bonds without the distractions of crowded spaces. When such groups crossed paths with solitary travelers, they greeted them warmly, then continued, their footsteps blending into a shared rhythm. The road also saw occasional encounters between people from different villages. These meetings were polite but cautious, shaped by curiosity rather than danger. Travelers would exchange a few words, asking where the other had come from or whether the road ahead was easy to walk. These conversations were never rushed. Even when the discussion lasted only a few seconds, the tone remained calm and respectful. The path offered neutral ground, a shared space where everyone's purpose was simple: to move gently through the landscape. Some of the most meaningful encounters were the quietest ones, moments when two strangers simply walked near each other for a while. They did not speak. They did not need to. They shared the road in silence, listening to the same wind, stepping across the same stones, watching the same shifting patterns of light. These shared silences were not uncomfortable. They felt natural, shaped by the road's peaceful spirit. When the moment came to part ways, one taking a turning path, the other continuing straight, travelers often exchanged a small nod of gratitude, acknowledging the brief companionship. Animals contributed to the atmosphere of these encounters. A traveler might come across a dog trotting along the road, seemingly on an errand of its own. Dogs often greeted travelers with gentle curiosity before continuing their independent journeys toward familiar destinations. Horses and donkeys occasionally appeared, led by farmers or carrying small loads along the path. Their presence added rhythm and softness to the road, their hoofbeats blending with footsteps in a steady cadence. Nature itself sometimes created encounters, though not with people. A sudden breeze rustling leaves, a bird gliding low across the path, or a deer pausing at the edge of a meadow. All these moments became part of the traveler's experience. These were not dramatic signs, but soft reminders that the path existed within a living world. Travelers often slowed their steps or paused to appreciate these encounters, absorbing the quiet energy that the landscape offered. Occasionally, the road became a place of unspoken cooperation. If a fallen branch blocked part of the path, travelers gently moved it aside. If a small stone marker had collapsed, someone might take a moment to rebuild it. If a footbridge looked unstable, people walked carefully and mentioned its condition to others they met. These acts were small, but they reflected the shared responsibility felt by all who walked the road. The path did not belong to any single person. It belonged to everyone who used it. And so everyone, in subtle ways, contributed to its care. Even weather created shared moments between travelers. A drizzle might cause two strangers to pause under the same tree, exchanging polite words about the unexpected rain while waiting for it to pass. A gust of wind on an open meadow might prompt a brief laugh or smile between two people struggling to keep their cloaks in place. In these gentle interactions, the environment itself felt like part of the community, shaping how people connected. Travelers also encountered one another during tasks that became small rituals along the road. At wells, they waited patiently as someone drew water before taking their turn. At clearings, they paused to admire the view together. At footbridges, they stepped carefully, allowing others to pass before crossing themselves. These moments were simple but meaningful. They reflected a quiet code of respect that had developed naturally over generations. Some encounters became stories remembered long after the walk ended. A kind word from a stranger, a helpful gesture offered without expectation, or a shared moment of appreciation for the landscape. All these experiences became woven into the traveler's South memory of the road. Even decades later, a passerby might recall how they once met an old man who taught them the name of a certain bird, or a young woman who pointed out a hidden spring nearby. These memories did not stand out as major events. They lingered because of their softness. Over time, the quiet encounters along these roads shaped the culture of the communities they connected. Villagers felt a sense of familiarity with one another not because they lived in the same place, but because they shared the same paths. They recognized each other's footsteps, greetings, and rhythms. The road acted as a gentle mediator, creating opportunities for connection without forcing interaction. In this way, the peaceful roads became more than physical routes. They became spaces where trust, understanding, and subtle forms of cooperation emerged naturally. Travelers learned to move with awareness and respect, to share silence comfortably, to acknowledge one another's presence without intrusion. The encounters shaped the identity of the road itself, transforming it into a symbol of calm human connection. Even in the present day, remnants of this spirit survive. Modern walkers on old paths often greet one another with the same quiet nods. Hikers stepping aside on narrow trails share brief moments of respect. People help clear small obstacles, rebuild stones, or leave markers for others. The traditions of the old roads persist, not because they were written down, but because they were felt deeply by generations who walked softly. The peaceful roads that led nowhere gave the world something rare, a space where strangers could meet gently, without urgency or expectation, and where brief encounters held meaning simply because they were shaped by the calm rhythm of the land. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me, wandering along the peaceful roads that once stretched gently across old Europe. These paths never promised a destination. They offered something simpler, a slow rhythm, soft footsteps, small encounters, and a sense of calm that settled into the land over generations. And tonight, I hope they brought a bit of that same calm into your own evening. If this story helped you relax or drift a little closer to sleep, don't forget to like the video. It truly supports the channel. And if you enjoy these soft, slow bedtime histories, make sure to subscribe so the next peaceful episode finds you whenever you need it. Before you rest, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which moment from the journey felt the most calming or memorable to you? Your answers help me shape the next gentle chapters.